Number 10. Harry S. Truman. While far from abject poverty, Harry Truman grew up with humble beginnings. 3 years before his birth, his parents bought a home together. It was just 20 by 28 feet with no plumbing or running water, in a town which one visitor disparagingly described as being at the end of the world. Truman was born here, but had no memories of it. His father's mule business had failed, and the family moved only 10 months after Truman's birth. After another business failure, the family moved again, this time in with Truman's maternal grandparents. Unaware of his father's financial troubles, Truman described his early years as the happiest childhood imaginable. He lived in a house shared by no less than 14 people at any given time, with family members from both sides, house aides, and the occasional poor person in the neighborhood. He had positive memories of many in his family, but most of all, his mother, and he'd remain close to his mother all the way into his presidency and until her death. While described as being a man of his word and being reliable, his father had no money or significant skills. His business failures left him perpetually stressed. He had an extreme temper and often overreacted to his children's smallest mistakes. That said, he was never physically abusive. In the early years of his life, Truman didn't attend school. However, he did regular farm work as well as work for neighbors. It was only when he was 8 that his parents used some inheritance money to move away from the farm and closer to a school so that Harry could get an education. Socially, he didn't always fit in, as his glasses wouldn't allow him to participate in rougher activities like sports or playing with the other boys, though he wasn't bullied or even teased too often. In academics, he excelled and was well liked by his teachers. When it came time to go to college, however, his dad, whose business ventures were always up and down, couldn't afford it. Since the start of the 20th century, Truman has been the only president not to graduate from college. He'd end up working in a mailroom and then as a timekeeper on a construction site before joining the Missouri National Guard and then the military during World War I. After the war, he pursued largely unsuccessful business ventures. However, his wartime experience ultimately benefited him in a political career. Number 9. Herbert Hoover. While not born into poverty, Herbert Hoover had a very modest upbringing. His home was a tiny cottage, only 12 by 20 feet, divided into a kitchen-family room combo and 2 bedrooms, one for the parents and one for the 3 children. His dad was the village blacksmith and a popular, sociable, and well-liked figure in a small Quaker community of about 400 people located in West Branch, Iowa. There was no public lighting and no public water other than a town pump. As per the Quaker ethic, people lived modestly. Many owned small farms, raising crops and animals for food. Individuality and hardiness were emphasized. The sick and needy were taken care of by the community, but the moment someone was able to work, they were on their own again. With open prairies and few trees, the winters were brutally cold and windy, and the summers extremely hot with little shade. Illnesses such as typhoid fever and malaria were extremely common, as was malnutrition due to limited dietary choices. Hoover had to overcome measles, diphtheria, and mumps. Despite this, he had fond memories of his early childhood and spoke of his parents and community with glowing praise. His best memories were of playing outside and exploring. At a young age, Hoover developed a love of nature, which he carried into his adult life. Tragedy struck when he was 6. His dad became sick when the community water got contaminated. He died shortly afterwards. Left with a modest life insurance policy, his mother worked as a seamstress to provide for the family. But 3 years later, when Herbert was 9, she contracted a cold and died. Hoover ended up living with his uncle in Oregon. His uncle, John Minthorn, was better off financially, owning a real estate company and a much larger home. However, life became harder as Minthorn demanded excellence. As a child, Hoover resented his uncle. Later, however, he'd attribute his work ethic, principles, and wisdom to his uncle's rearing. During the day, He worked as an office assistant for Minthorn, and at night he went to school for advanced mathematics. Upon getting into Stanford University, he became a geology major, which put him on a quick path to success. At 23, he was hired by a mining company and earned a yearly salary of $5,000, equivalent to about $160,000 in 2021. By the time Hoover was 40, his personal fortune was equivalent to $100 million today. Hoover always attributed his success to his upbringing. Number 8. Martin Van Buren. When Martin Van Buren was born in 1782, no one would have guessed he'd ever become president. His ancestors had emigrated to Manhattan Island back in 1631, and in over 100 years, the Van Burens had never strayed far. In fact, Martin's birthplace and childhood home was only a few miles away from this original site. His father, Abraham, was a simple farmer. Van Buren would later describe him as an amiable man who had no enemies, but also had little talent for making or saving money. Eventually reaching a total of 8 children, Abraham had to turn his farmhouse into a tavern and inn just to support his family. Apart from this income, he continued to farm along with his 6 slaves. The fact that he owned slaves at all might imply some wealth. In actuality, Abraham was only a little above his slaves in the social hierarchy of Kinderhook, New York. Little Martin seemed destined for a similar life, but quickly took advantage of opportunities around him. At just 14, he began studying law under Peter Sylvester, a local attorney, and the only attorney to practice in Kinderhook up to that point. While this equipped Martin with knowledge, he had learned just as valuable skills at home. People from all over the country, of various backgrounds and social statuses, would come to stay at his father's inn. Interactions with all these different people taught Martin the art of compromise and manipulation, the skills he'd become most known for in his political career. It was these skills, along with legal knowledge, that allowed him to climb the social ladder in Kinderhook and eventually enter the larger political stage. While he always knew how to put on a happy face, those who knew him best knew he had insecurities and resentment about his upbringing. Van Buren later recalled a particularly painful account when a wealthy resident of Kinderhook refused to even talk to him because of his status. He also recalled with great satisfaction how he later purchased the man's mansion and turned it into his own estate. Number 7. Lyndon B. Johnson. Prior to Johnson's birth, his father, Sam Ely Johnson, had already served nearly 3 years in the House of Representatives. He was ambitious and competitive both politically and financially, making investments in real estate and cotton. However, prior to Lyndon's birth, bad investments sent Sam thousands of dollars into debt. Therefore, young Lyndon grew up in a home with no electricity or running water. In fact, no one in the poor and destitute city had a toilet in their house. Lyndon's mother, Rebecca, recalled that the stores didn't carry bread as there was no demand for it. The modest people were so frugal with their money that they would rather make their own bread. The Johnson family's financial status went up and down due to Sam's risky investments. At one point, Sam made enough to hire a personal chauffeur and cleaning staff for his wife. At other points, however, they feared their house would be taken away by the bank. When times were really tough, neighbors would bring food over to the house, otherwise the family wouldn't eat. The couple scrimped money together just to send Lyndon to college. After failing at school and drifting with friends for a few months, Lyndon would eventually find his niche in teaching. However, he was determined to do well for himself, and teaching in impoverished communities wasn't very lucrative. When I was 14 years old, Lyndon later said, I decided I was not going to be the victim of a system which would allow the price of a commodity like cotton to drop from 40 cents to 6 cents and destroy the homes of people like my own family. Famously, Lyndon had even told his classmates that he'd be president one day. His father's political connections finally paid off. They'd lead Lyndon on a long political climb from a job as an office aide to eventually the presidency. Johnson repeatedly stated that his poor upbringing had an effect on his political policies and his war on poverty. Number 6. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's childhood was marked by poverty, tragedy, and hardship. He was born into a small town in California to Francis and Hannah Nixon. Francis managed a lemon farm, but in 1922, when Nixon was 9, the farm failed and the family had to relocate to near Hannah's relatives. Here his father took his hand at entrepreneurship again. He opened a store which was a combination between a grocery store and a gas station. The whole family worked to keep the store going. The only reason we were able to make it go, Nixon later said, was because my mother and dad had 5 boys, and we all worked in the store. Even then, they just barely got by. An average day for Nixon, at age 15, began at 4 a.m. He'd drive to the market and purchase vegetables, drive back to the store, wash and display the vegetables, and then go to school. Nevertheless, Nixon excelled in his education. He engaged in extracurricular activities such as sports and drama. He'd even earn a scholarship to Harvard. However, he'd have to turn it down. His older brother Harold was suffering from tuberculosis, and Richard was needed at the store. Harold ended up dying in 1933 when Richard was 20. In 1925, his younger brother had also died. These deaths affected him deeply. For much of his childhood, his mother was caring for his sickly brothers, meaning he was often neglected. When she was able to give Richard attention, she was controlling. Throughout his adult life, Nixon would speak very well of his mother, even calling her a saint. However, biographers believe the unbalanced relationship had negative effects on his mental state. His father, Francis, had been described as the opposite of Hannah, an argumentative and, quote, restless, frustrated, and angry man, a mean-spirited person who psychologically abused his 5 sons and sometimes beat them. But even outside of the family, things weren't easy for young Richard. Since he turned down the scholarship from Harvard, he would need to work his way through school. Despite his excellent academic performance, he was turned down for membership into the Literary Society. Nixon felt he'd been rejected on the basis of his social status. And later, a similar incident would happen when he was rejected for a job in the FBI. In his early 20s, he was accepted into a law firm, which ultimately put him on the road to success. But Nixon's early experiences would affect him for the rest of his life. Number 5. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was born a second-generation immigrant. His parents immigrated from Ireland in their 20s, and though they had some wealthy relatives in Ireland, they had very little in America. Jackson was born in 1767, 2 years after his parents emigrated. He was the youngest of 3 children. He was also the first president to be born in a log cabin. 3 weeks before Andrew's birth, his father was killed in a logging accident. His mother then moved in with her sister and her 8 children, leaving Jackson without a father. Furthermore, Jackson's mother wasn't allowed to live there simply out of charity. Mrs. Jackson was permanently established in the family as housekeeper and in poor relation, neighbors later said. Growing up in a home where he and his family were only guests had a profound impact on young Andrew. His wife's niece later said of Jackson, quote, his childish recollections were of humiliating dependence and galling discomfort, his mother performing household drudgery in return for the maintenance of herself and her children. Despite this, he was also described as a spirited and fun-loving child, though he also had a furious temper. It wasn't long into Jackson's life that he was getting into regular fights. This has been attributed to his lack of a father figure. It would affect him well into adulthood, as he was involved in many physical fights, countless duels, and numerous hostile verbal interactions. By just age 14, Jackson had lost more than simply his father. At this point in his life, all of his immediate family were dead. His oldest brother died of heat stroke shortly after enlisting in the army. Then his brother Robert died of smallpox while in British captivity, and his mother contracted cholera while attending to injured soldiers. Jackson blamed the British for the deaths in his family. Poor relations with his extended family meant Jackson was hopping from home to home during his teenage years. When he was 16, he actually received a sizable inheritance from his wealthy grandfather, though he quickly squandered this money on clothes, gambling, and other hobbies. By this point, however, Jackson did already have a job teaching. Despite the reputation he'd later have in politics, Jackson was actually well-read at a young age, at least relative to others in the area. For example, when he was 9, the Declaration of Independence arrived in the town. Few could even read it. Not only could young Jackson do so, but he also read it aloud and publicly. Though he was prone to misspellings and bad pronunciation, his ability to read and write at a young age greatly elevated his status. After his teaching job, he would begin studying law, and just 3 years later, at age 20, he was working as a prosecuting attorney. Though Jackson became a self-made man at a young age, his harsh upbringing left him scarred. The deaths in his family left him with a lifelong prejudice against the British. He'd never learned to properly manage his temper and emotions. His enemies would take advantage of this all throughout his life. And even though Jackson was wiser and much more knowledgeable than his opponents believed, he'd always have a reputation as an uneducated, maladjusted brute. Number 4. Abraham Lincoln. The idea that Abraham Lincoln grew up in abject poverty is now considered an exaggeration, one that was likely devised by his political supporters. Historians have since come to the conclusion that his upbringing was rather typical for a pioneer family. Nevertheless, it was the life of a pioneer family, and one defined by hard work, manual labor, and, for young Lincoln, dissatisfaction. Though not the first president born into a log cabin, Abraham Lincoln is the most well known for it. The cabin was one room, 16 by 18 feet, with a dirt floor and a single window. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a carpenter and a farmer. A man who only knew a life of manual labor, as necessity had forced him into it at a young age. Abraham was his only son to survive infancy, and Thomas put him to work at 8 years old. Abraham was already strong and capable enough to cut wood with an axe. Lincoln would later recount that he would spend much of his time for the next decade and a half with an axe in his hand, performing hard manual labor. A year prior, Lincoln had his only experience in traditional education, being taught for 12 months at a local school. This experience gave him a taste of the life he truly wanted. Despite being 6 foot 2 inches at age 16 and incredibly good at manual labor, he desired a different life. He loved reading and writing, reading whenever he could get a break from work and often writing his own poems. Through self-study and tutelage of traveling teachers, he attained his education, which he later admitted was flawed, and he would describe it as defective. But this was the best that Lincoln could do. Considering his father's health problems and the fact that at times they had little more than potatoes to eat, his father simply couldn't see the value in Lincoln's constant reading. At age 22, Lincoln set out on his own, moving to the city, New Salem. Then at age 25, after years of working jobs such as rail splitter, carpenter, blacksmith, land surveyor, and store clerk, he at last obtained his law license. The story of Lincoln's upbringing would eventually be used for political gain, but if it weren't for this reason, it's doubtful Lincoln would have become so open about it. According to an early law partner, Lincoln would talk about his background only with reluctance and reservations. Perhaps the most succinct reflection Lincoln gave on his childhood was in a speech on slavery when he made the statement, "I used to be a slave." Number 3. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was born in a tiny log cabin. As a child, he'd watch his dad work on the family's plot of land, only then to see it taken away from his dad in a legal dispute. This affected Fillmore profoundly. He was determined to get out of the life he seemed to be destined for. His father encouraged him to pursue the trades, but this wasn't the path Fillmore wanted, as he always found physical work tedious and laborious. With the little spare time he had, he read books from the library, acquiring all the knowledge he could. At 14, he worked in a textile mill and kept a dictionary at his workstation. Quote, "While attending to the carding machines, I used to place the dictionary on the desk, by which I passed every 2 minutes, and in this way I would have a moment in which to look at a word and read its definition, and could then fix it to my memory." He left work on foot, carrying a knapsack. When the county judge offered him a job as a law clerk, Fillmore seemed to be moving up in the world. He took up a teaching job, and townspeople became impressed by his speaking. At this point, Fillmore was only in his early 20s. His rapid growth and ambition often meant that he quit jobs long before his contracts were up and had to use his new job to pay for the time he didn't work. By age 25, he had the training to be a lawyer, and by 28, he was elected to his first public office. Number 2, James A. Garfield. When James Garfield was only an infant, his father died, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings herself. His older brother, who was 10 years older than him, and his sisters had to adapt to a hard life early and help their mother in maintaining the family farm. Young James actually had it a bit easier, being the youngest and therefore more pampered child. Though lazy and stubborn, Garfield was good-natured, and the family took joy in listening to him read the Bible at a very young age. While he had a loving family, he didn't remain sheltered from hardship for long. Kids in the neighborhood bullied and criticized Garfield for his family's poverty. Quote, "Cold-hearted men frowned upon me, and I was made the ridicule and sport of boys that had fathers and enjoyed the luxuries of life." As Garfield got older, he grew to be a very physically imposing man and would deal with his harassers with violence, much to his family's dismay. The tiniest insult could provoke a fight from Garfield. Later in life, fellow politicians noted he was sensitive as a girl and had the skin of a rabbit. Though he could fight, at heart, he wasn't a fighter. Garfield was a dreamer and loved to read books. In fact, while he worked manual labor jobs, he'd often screw up because of his elaborate daydreaming. At age 17, after some failed attempts at manual labor work, he finally enrolled in a local university at the urging of his mother. In this environment, Garfield thrived with his studies and with his peers. His years of physical labor weren't over, though. He'd have to work many different jobs to pay for his enrollment. But through this hardship, Garfield was on the path to his future career. The story of his upbringing would work to his advantage once he entered politics. Publicly, it made for an inspiring story, but privately, he didn't speak fondly of it. Quote, "Precious 17 years in which a boy with a father and some wealth might have become fixed in many ways. Let no man praise me because I was poor and without a helper. It was very bad for my life." Number 1, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in North Carolina. His family was incredibly poor. His father was a hostler and a stableman, and his mother a washerwoman. When Andrew was only 3, his father died. His mother remarried, but her new husband was also poor. The townspeople disliked the Johnsons, considering them to be mudsills or white trash. Once Johnson and his cousins ran through a path near a wealthy man's house. The man had 2 workers chase the boys, whipping them all the way back home. The first time Johnson took serious interest in a girl, he was denied a relationship by the girl's mother, who saw no advantage in her daughter having a relationship with a poor boy of such little potential. He'd play with poor black children. Despite their shared experience of poverty, Johnson, as other poor white children of the time, saw himself as better than the poor blacks. He never attended school and had no formal education. At 10 years old, he began an apprenticeship as a tailor. As an apprentice, Johnson was treated only a little better than a slave. The apprenticeship was supposed to last until he was 21, but Johnson wouldn't follow through. He ran away from town after he and some friends hurled pieces of wood at a neighbor's house, and a call was put out for his capture. Moving from state to state, he'd eventually settle in Greenville, Tennessee. At 18, he married 16-year-old Eliza McCardle, and she taught him how to read and write. He'd make well on his skills as a tailor and start his own business, where he became known for his exceptional workmanship. At 21, he was elected as Greenville's mayor. This was the start of his life as a political figure. Johnson never got over the treatment he received for being poor. Many speculate that this is why he could be so bitter, obstinate, and aggressive. However, his struggles became a political asset. In speeches, he would often share stories of his humble beginnings. To support regular uploads from this channel, consider subscribing and donating to Resyndicated on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.